Hi, I'm Amy from A. Marini Designs, and I am so excited to have you here today as we sew through this flower jar block. You can find the link to this pattern down in the description below. It's a really fun one. It finishes at 12 inches square, so it's perfect for adding into pillows, sampler quilts, or any other project where a 12-inch block is used. There's a few tips that I have for you that will help this process go a little bit smoother, hopefully for you. The first one is to choose fabrics that aren't directional. It's just going to save you so much thought and headache down the road if you have your fabrics not directional. Then you don't have to pay attention to that's one less thing to be worrying about as you sew. The second tip that I have for you is to make sure when you're choosing your fabrics that there's plenty of contrast between the different parts of your block. You want your flower petals to be distinct from the flower centers. You want the jar to stand out, and you want all of that to contrast nicely with your background. So make sure as you're choosing things that you are keeping scale and contrast especially into account. I want to show you an example of one that I did. Now the jar on this one is a really pale blue, but you really can't see it. It's too pale. There's not enough contrast between the background and the jar. So make sure that you're selecting fabrics that really stand out. This is a great example where you can see all of the different aspects of it. You don't want your hard work on all of these fun details to get lost. The next tip I have for you is, because we are doing a lot of stitch and flip corners here, to starch your background, or your background, but all of your fabrics, to starch them really well. Make sure that you give them a good starch. You can use any starch that you want. I like to just use one from the big box store near me, but you can use any kind of starch you want. It just really helps to give it a good starch before you cut your pieces out. It helps to more accurately cut your pieces. It helps to keep everything kind of sewing through together and keep things from stretching. And the other thing that it helps with is helping all of those seams lay really flat. There's a couple areas in here that there's quite a few seams and quite a lot of fabric. And so being able to get those seams nice and flat will help the construction come together so much more easily. Another quick tip that I have, this may help speed up your process, is if you have a machine that does not have a laser guide, you can create your own using a piece of washi tape, or sometimes I even just use a Post-it note to create a line that comes out straight out from your needle. And that will give you a guide so that you don't have to draw all the diagonal lines on your stitch and flip corners. Now, if you're new to stitch and flip corners, I would probably recommend actually doing both. Draw your lines and use the tape. But if you're a little bit more comfortable with those corners, then adding that taped guide can give you a little bit of freedom to not have to draw all those lines and get you moving through the process just a little bit faster. Take your time, pay attention to the directions for pressing seam allowances. There's a couple of places where it really does matter to get all of the seams to nest correctly and to help you get grids lined up nice and well. And so pay attention to those pressing directions that are in. If it doesn't say which direction to press a seam, then you can choose and it really won't matter in the end. But there are a couple of places where it does matter. I think that's all the tips I have for you today. If you're ready, let's get sewing. To begin assembling our flower jar block, we are going to begin to assemble and prep the pieces so that we can bring the whole thing together. And the first one we're going to start with is the flower center block. So you're going to take your flower center piece and the 4 petal pieces, the 4 small squares of the petal fabric that you are going to use for this flower. You're going to start by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of one of these squares. And one of the tips I have for this, I like to take whatever I'm using to mark the line, and I'm going to just place it right on the corner there, and then use that to help me line up my ruler here. And sometimes I'll even you'll have a line on there that's a 45-degree line, and line it up with the edge of this little square. That way I can account for the width of the marking tool, whatever it is that I'm using, to make sure that I get a really good straight line as close to the center as I can. So I'm going to draw that line, and I'm going to do it on all 4 of these little squares that I'm going to do. Then you are going to place it right sides together on one of the corners of your flower center block. Now your diagonal line should connect 2 sides of that square, and then you're going to sew right on that drawn line. And then we're going to trim a 1/4 inch or a scant 1/4 inch away from that sewn line. Then we are going to press the seam open, and it's going to look just like that. When I press these open, I like to use a quilter's clapper or a book, or sometimes even just my acrylic ruler. And while the piece is still warm, I will set that on top to just help hold it flat while it cools, so that I can get all of these flipped corners to lay nice and flat as I go through them. It just helps when you go to assemble the different pieces together if these aren't like super wonky. So once you have that first corner done, we're going to take all the rest, the other 3 corners for this flower center square, and we're going to sew them on in exactly the same way so that we have a block or a piece that looks just like this. All 4 corners with the petal color fabric on each of the flowers, the flower center squares. All right, once we have that done for all 3 of our flower centers, then we are going to move on to preparing our petal pieces. So we are going to do these the exact same way. We're going to take a petal piece. We are going to take a background fabric piece. So again, on the wrong side, you can draw your diagonal line. Then you're going to line that up with one of the corners and sew along that line and trim it away. Once you press it, it's going to look like this. Then we're going to take a second square and we're going to put it in the corner on the same side on the long side. Okay, so we want 2 corners on the same side of our petal piece. So again, I'm going to draw my line here, sew, cut, press, and then I will have a petal piece that looks just like this. We're going to do this same thing with all 4 of the petals for our flower 1, and we're going to do this with 6 of the petals from our flower 2. Now when we come to the last 2 petals for flower 2, you are going to, sometimes I find it helpful to do these together. When I'm doing a lot of the corners and stuff, I will get going chain piecing and stuff, and that's awesome. But when it comes to something like this, I want to make sure that I'm getting things lined up the right way and stuff. And so sometimes it's helpful to do the 2 of them together. And then you can make sure that you are getting things on the right side. And what I mean by that is, what we're going to do is for each of these pieces, we need 1 small background square and 1 small flower jar. Let me move these up a little. 1 flower jar small square. So we need 1 of each for both of these petal pieces. So I always start with the background piece again, just because it's easier for me to remember. We've been doing that with all the other petals. And you're going to do the same thing on one side of 1 petal. And then on the other petal, you want to make sure that that background piece gets put on the opposite corner so that these are going to be mirror images of each other. We're going to sew and trim and press on both of these, and then we are going to do the same thing with the jar fabric. You're going to put it on the other corner of the same side of that petal, and then we're going to do the same thing with the second one. And again, they should be opposite sides so that these 2 are reflections and mirror images of each other. So make sure that you get those positioned correctly, stitch, press, trim, all the same as these. And then we have all of our petal pieces done. Once we have all of our petals done, the next part is to work on our jar. So we're going to start with the top of our jar, and we are going to take our skinny jar piece and our skinny accent piece, and then our larger jar neck piece. And we are going to sew these 3 together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do like to press the seams open on these as well. It gets a little bulky as we add in all the extra pieces here, so opening up those seams just kind of reduces some of the bulk in those seam allowances. Once you have that piece pressed, the last piece to work on is our jar piece, and we are going to do stitch and flip corners on all 4 of these corners as well. We are going to do 2 small background squares at the top 2 corners and 2 of the larger background squares on the bottom 2 corners. Again, you're going to draw your diagonal line, sew, trim, press, and do that on all 4 corners here. And once that's done, we have all of our pieces pressed and we're ready to begin assembling our block. To begin assembling our Flower One jar block, this is going to be the center segment of our flower block. You're going to begin by taking one of the petal pieces from Flower One and two of the larger background squares and sewing them on either side of your petal piece. You want to press your seam allowances towards the petal. Then you're going to take the flower centerpiece for your Flower One and two more flower petals, and you are going to sew those on either side of your flower centerpiece. Again, you want to press your seam allowances towards the petals. And the last step, or the next step in preparing this segment, is to take your jar neck block section here and one more, your last Flower One petal piece, and you are going to sew the petal to the top of the jar piece. Let me slide this up so you can see it a little better. So you're going to sew it to the top. Now you want to make sure that this top section that is sewn to this petal here is the skinnier section of the two jar pieces. Let me bring that up so you can see. So we want it to be sewn to this one, and you want to sew the side of the petal with the background corners to that jar piece. So we'll take these right sides together and sew right along that seam. And then you will press that seam allowance as directed in the pattern. To continue on with our Flower One jar segment of the block, you are going to next take your Flower One petal with the two background squares and your flower centerpiece with the two petals, and you are going to put those right sides together and sew them together. Now, the reason that we pressed the seam allowances towards the petals is so that at this stage, those seams should all nest together. So pay attention to the seams between the flower center and the petals and the petal and your background squares, and make sure that those segments are all lined up. I usually put a pin in each of those seams just so that it lines up nicely. And then you're going to sew across that. And I usually find it easiest to press the seam allowance towards the petal piece just because there's fewer angled seams there, but you can press it open or whatever seam feels best to you. Next, we're going to take our jar top and petal segment, and we are actually going to add two of our Flower Two petals to the sides of this piece. So you want to make sure that you have the two Flower Two petals that have the two different corners on here, and you want to make sure that the jar corners are towards the bottom of those petal pieces. So you will put this right sides together. Again, make sure that the jar fabrics are lined up with each other, and sew along this seam, and then again repeat that for the second seam. So make sure that your corners here that have the different fabrics are towards this jar top petal piece, and that your flower jar fabric is to the bottom of both of those petal pieces. Now that we have those two pieces all sewn together for our Flower One jar block, we are ready to finish this column. So we are going to sew the Flower One piece on top of the flower petal jar top pieces. So you'll sew those two together. Then we are going to sew the jar block, and you are going to put the smaller squares of your jar block at the top, and the larger squares will be down at the bottom. And then you're going to take these two skinny background pieces and sew them to the top and the bottom of that column. So you're just going to sew each of those seams together to finish up the Flower One jar column. For the Flower Two sides of our block, this is going to be for both the left and the right side. You're going to begin with a Flower Two center, and then you are going to take two of your Flower Two petals and sew them to the top and the bottom of the flower centerpiece, again pressing your seam allowances towards the petal. Repeat that with the second Flower Two center and two more Flower Two petals. Then you're going to take two more of your Flower Two petals And on each one, you are going to take one of your larger background squares and sew them to either side of that petal piece. Again, pressing your seam allowances towards the center. So you should have 2 flower center with 2 petal pieces and 2 flower 2 petals with background squares on either side. For our flower 2 segments for the 2 sides, you are going to take 1 flower center with 2 petal pieces and 1 flower 2 petal with the background squares, and you are going to sew them together. Now you want to make sure that you are sewing the petal on opposite sides for the 2 different sides. Now, if you're using a non-directional fabric, this is something that can be flipped, so it's not really critical at this point that you're paying attention necessarily to the directionality, but if you have any directionality in your fabrics or anything that you're trying to keep up, you want to make sure that you're sewing 1 onto the left side of that flower center, and then on the second flower center petal piece, you're sewing it onto the right side. So just make sure that you're paying attention to that if you have some directionality at this point. If you're like me and your fabrics don't really have any directionality to them, there's a point later on, and I'll point that out, where it's more critical that you're paying attention to the direction that this is on. So once you have those 2 done, then we are going to come back to the next step. To finish our flower 2 columns, both the right and the left side, you are going to take your flower 2 pieces, and this is the stage where you really want to make sure that you have your right and your left sides together. So even if you've sewn them together, there's no directionality, they are very similar, but you want to make sure you have them arranged so that you have one with the petal to the right and one with the petal to the left. Then you're going to take 2 of these skinny background rectangles and sew them to the petal side of your flower 2 block. Once those are sewn on, then we will take our 2 background rectangles. You're going to sew the smaller one to the top and the larger one to the bottom. And you're going to repeat that on both sides. So again, when you're sewing on this side rectangle piece, you may lose that directionality. So when you are sewing on these small and large background pieces, that is when you really need to be making sure that you have these facing the right direction so that you end up with mirror images of each other to go on either side of the center block. We're going to take those to our sewing machine, sew all of those seams together, and then we'll come back and assemble our final block. Now that we have our 3 segments together, the final steps are to just sew these 2 long seams together. Now you do want to pay attention to this flower center for your flower 2 blocks and your flower 2 petals. Those seams should nest if you've pressed the seam allowances as indicated in the pattern. And so that is a place that you will want to pay attention and make sure you pin it well so that those segments line up just how you want them to. But we have 2 more seams and then our flower jar block is finished.